The morning of June 6, 1944, Omaha Beach, Normandy. Staff Sergeant Victor Haas of the 1st Infantry Division's 16th Regiment crouched in the landing craft as it approached the shore through sheets of German machine gun fire. Around him, soldiers pressed themselves against the steel sides of the Higgins boat, but Haas wore something that set him apart. A canvas vest reinforced with overlapping manganese steel plates that covered his torso from collarbone to waist. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The Army had officially rejected this equipment 18 months earlier, called it too heavy, too restrictive, too expensive to produce, but Haas had requisitioned 6 of them anyway through back channels at Fort Benning, and now 37 men in his company wore vests that the Pentagon had decided American soldiers didn't need. In the next 4 hours, those 37 men would absorb wounds that should have been fatal. By nightfall, commanders would be demanding answers about why more men hadn't been issued this rejected equipment, and how a single sergeant had known better than an entire procurement system. The flak jacket's story began not with military planners, but with a fundamental misunderstanding about how men actually died in modern warfare. When the Army began planning for the invasion of Europe in 1942, casualty projections focused heavily on rifle and machine gun fire. This made intuitive sense. Wars were won and lost through infantry combat, and infantry combat meant bullets. Doctrine emphasized small arms marksmanship, tactical movement under fire, and the aggressive advance that had characterized American fighting in World War I. But the nature of death on the battlefield had changed dramatically since 1918, and few people in positions of authority had recognized it. The first hint came from medical officers analyzing casualty data from North Africa in 1943. Captain James Coates, a surgeon with the 2nd Armored Division, spent 3 months documenting the wounds treated at his field hospital near Kasserine Pass. What he found contradicted everything the training manuals assumed. Of the 417 combat casualties his unit treated between January and March 1943, only 72 had been hit by rifle or machine gun bullets. The rest, over 80%, had been wounded by fragments from artillery shells, mortar rounds, grenades, or aerial bombs. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The wounds told a story that tactical doctrine had missed. Modern artillery had evolved into something far deadlier than the guns of 1918. German 88mm shells could blanket an area the size of a football field, with thousands of steel fragments traveling at velocities exceeding 2,000 feet per second. A single mortar barrage could wound dozens of men simultaneously, not through direct hits, but through the metal storm that erupted when shells detonated. Captain Coates documented the specific nature of these wounds with clinical precision. Fragments typically ranged from the size of a grain of rice to a silver dollar. They tumbled as they flew, creating irregular wound channels that caused massive tissue damage. Most fragments struck men in the torso, arms, or legs, the areas with the largest surface exposure. A significant percentage of casualties had multiple fragment wounds, suggesting they'd been caught in overlapping blast patterns from several shells. What struck Coates most forcefully was how preventable many of these wounds appeared. The fragments that killed or incapacitated soldiers often had relatively low kinetic energy by the time they reached their targets. Unlike rifle bullets that retained lethal velocity over hundreds of yards, shell fragments lost energy rapidly. Many of the fragments he extracted from wounded soldiers had barely penetrated the skin. A few millimeters of steel plate in the right location might have stopped them entirely. He included these observations in his monthly medical report, which made its way through channels to the office of the Surgeon General in Washington. The report arrived at a moment when the Army was wrestling with competing equipment priorities. The invasion of Europe would require unprecedented quantities of everything: tanks, trucks, landing craft, ammunition, food, medical supplies. Every pound of steel allocated to one purpose meant a pound unavailable for something else. The War Department's procurement officers faced an impossible calculus of competing needs. The idea of personal armor for infantry soldiers wasn't new. Medieval knights had worn plate armor. Soldiers in the trenches of World War I had experimented with steel breastplates, though most found them too heavy and restrictive for practical use. What was new was the possibility of creating armor light enough for sustained wear, while still offering meaningful protection against the fragments that caused most casualties. Research into this possibility had begun in 1942 at the Army's Engineering Board at Fort Benning, Georgia. Colonel Malcolm Grow, a flight surgeon who'd witnessed the effectiveness of improvised armor plating on bomber aircraft, championed the project. He assembled a team of engineers, physicians, and ordnance specialists to explore whether similar principles could protect ground troops. The team, working with minimal funding and low priority, had produced several prototype designs by late 1942. The most promising design came from a civilian engineer named Dabs Bashara, who'd worked for the Chrysler Corporation before the war. Bashara approached the problem from first principles. Steel plate thick enough to stop rifle bullets would weigh 30 to 40 pounds, far too heavy for infantry use. But fragments from artillery shells travelled at lower velocities than bullets and often tumbled in flight, making them easier to stop. A vest, using multiple layers of relatively thin manganese steel plate, could potentially stop most fragments while weighing under 10 pounds. His prototype used overlapping plates, each measuring approximately 3 inches by 4 inches and 1/16 of an inch thick. The plates were sewn into pockets in a canvas vest that distributed weight across the shoulders and torso. The overlapping design meant fragments hitting at an angle would strike at least 2 layers of steel. Testing at Aberdeen Proving Ground in Maryland showed the vest could stop 70% of the fragment types commonly produced by German artillery shells. The test results reached the War Department in December 1942, arriving on desks where officers were making decisions about what equipment would be produced for the European invasion. The discussion that followed revealed a fundamental tension between engineering capability and institutional priorities. The vests worked. Testing proved that conclusively. But producing them in sufficient quantities would require diverting steel, manufacturing capacity, and shipping space from other critical needs. The Army's Quartermaster Corps conducted a cost analysis. Manufacturing enough vests to equip the projected invasion force would require approximately 7,000 tons of manganese steel and production facilities capable of stamping, treating, and assembling millions of individual plates. Those facilities were currently producing armor plate for tanks, hull plating for landing craft, and structural steel for ships. Shifting production would delay delivery of other equipment by weeks or months. More troubling was the weight issue. Each vest weighed 9 pounds, and soldiers already carried combat loads approaching 100 pounds. Add a vest, and you were asking men to assault fortified positions while carrying loads that would exhaust them before they reached the objective. Infantry officers reviewing the proposal expressed skepticism that soldiers could function effectively while wearing the additional weight during sustained combat operations. The debate culminated in a decision made in January 1943. The War Department acknowledged that the vests offered meaningful protection, but concluded that the tactical disadvantages and production costs outweighed the benefits. The program was officially terminated. Fort Benning was directed to focus its limited research resources on other priorities. The prototype vests were placed in storage, another promising idea that hadn't survived contact with institutional reality. This is where Staff Sergeant Victor Haas enters the story. Haas was 32 years old in 1943, older than most sergeants, with a background that gave him an unusual perspective on military equipment. Before the war, he'd worked as a safety inspector for a steel fabrication company in Pennsylvania, a job that required understanding how materials failed under stress and how to prevent industrial accidents. He'd enlisted in 1941, and his technical background had made him valuable to commanders who needed someone who could maintain equipment and solve mechanical problems. By spring of 1943, Haas was assigned to a training company at Fort Benning, preparing soldiers for deployment to Europe. He'd heard rumors about the armor vest program and had seen some of the test reports that circulated among the engineering board staff. What interested him wasn't the War Department's decision to cancel the program, it was the casualty data that had motivated the research in the first place. If 80% of wounds came from fragments and if a 10-pound vest could prevent 70% of those wounds, then the arithmetic seemed straightforward. You were trading 10 pounds of weight for a 70% reduction in the primary cause of casualties. Haas did something that sergeants throughout history have done when they see a gap between official policy and battlefield reality. He went around the system. He contacted a colleague who worked in the engineering board's storage facility and arranged to acquire 12 of the prototype vests that were gathering dust in a warehouse. No requisition, no paperwork, just an understanding between NCOs that sometimes the right equipment matters more than proper channels. He began wearing one of the vests during training exercises, testing how it affected his mobility and endurance. The weight was noticeable but not crippling. He could run, jump, crawl through obstacles, and maintain a combat pace for hours without significant impairment. The vest restricted his range of motion somewhat when reaching overhead, but in combat, soldiers spent most of their time crouched or prone anyway. He concluded that a reasonably fit soldier could adapt to the weight within a few days of constant wear. More importantly, he began showing the vests to soldiers in his company and explaining the casualty statistics from North Africa. Most soldiers had no idea that artillery fragments caused the majority of wounds. Training focused on rifle marksmanship and small unit tactics, with artillery portrayed as area denial weapon rather than the primary killer on the battlefield. When Haas explained that wearing a 10-pound vest could reduce their chance of being wounded by 70%, soldiers' attitudes changed rapidly. Suddenly the weight seemed like a bargain. By the time his company deployed to England in February 1944 as part of the massive build-up for the invasion, 37 soldiers had acquired vests through Haas's informal supply network. They wore them during training exercises on the English coast, getting accustomed to the weight and developing techniques for moving effectively while armoured. Officers in the company noticed but said nothing. Nobody wanted to be the one who confiscated equipment that might save lives, regardless of what official policy stated. The vests attracted attention from soldiers in other units who saw them during joint training exercises. Word spread that Haas's platoon had access to armour that could stop shrapnel. Requests flooded in for more vests, but Haas's supply was exhausted. He'd acquired every prototype he could locate, and without official production, no more were available. He found himself in the frustrating position of knowing that equipment existed to protect soldiers while being unable to obtain it through any legitimate channel. In the final weeks before the invasion, intelligence briefings made clear what awaited on the Normandy beaches. The Germans had fortified the coast with extensive defensive works including concrete bunkers, machine gun positions, mortar pits, and artillery emplacements. They'd pre-registered artillery on every potential landing zone, meaning German gunners could drop shells on attacking forces with minimal adjustment. The invasion plan called for overwhelming the defences through the sheer weight of men and material, accepting that casualties in the first waves would be catastrophic. Staff Sergeant Haas understood that his 37 soldiers wearing rejected armour vests would soon provide the test that the War Department had never conducted. Not controlled experiments at Aberdeen Proving Ground, but combat conditions where the cost of failure was measured in lives rather than data points. On the evening of June 5th, as his company prepared to board the transports that would carry them across the English Channel, he gathered the men wearing vests for a final briefing. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so, if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. Listen carefully, he told them. These vests will stop most shrapnel, but they won't stop rifle bullets at close range. They'll protect your torso, but not your head, arms, or legs. Don't get careless thinking you're invulnerable. The armour gives you an edge, not immunity. Stay low, move fast, and use cover like your life depends on it, because it does. Remember that men without vests are relying on you to help them survive. You've got protection they don't have, which means you've got responsibility they don't have. The invasion force crossed the channel through the night, and as dawn broke on June 6th, Haas found himself in a landing craft approaching Omaha beach through heavy seas. The German defences that dominated the bluffs overlooking the beach had survived the pre-invasion bombardment largely intact. As the landing craft neared shore, artillery shells began falling among the boats, sending up geysers of water and shrapnel. The distinctive crack of 88mm guns echoed across the water, and Haas realized they were heading into exactly the kind of fragment-intensive environment that the vests had been designed for. The ramp dropped at 0630 hours, and machine gun fire raked the front ranks before they could exit the boat. Haas moved left, diving into chest-deep water as tracers snapped overhead. Around him, men struggled forward through the surf, burdened by equipment that became impossibly heavy when waterlogged. Mortar rounds began impacting among the soldiers wading toward shore, each detonation sending up columns of water mixed with steel fragments. Haas felt multiple impacts against his torso as he struggled through the surf, sharp blows that would have penetrated flesh but were stopped by the manganese steel plates. He reached the beach and threw himself behind a steel obstacle, gasping for breath, assessing his condition. No blood, no penetrating wounds. The vest had absorbed fragments that would have torn through his chest and abdomen. Around him, soldiers were falling, cut down by the storm of metal that swept the beach. The ones wearing vests were still moving. The next 4 hours became a desperate struggle to advance up the beach against defences that should have made the landing impossible. German artillery zeroed in on the landing zones, dropping shells with methodical precision. Every explosion sent fragments slicing through the air at lethal velocities, creating an environment where simply standing upright invited multiple wounds. Haas watched soldiers fall all around him, but he began noticing a pattern that medical officers would later confirm through careful analysis of casualty records. The 37 men wearing vests were taking hits but continuing to function. A private named Robert Chen took a fragment in the chest that knocked him flat, but the steel plate stopped it from penetrating. He got up and kept moving. Corporal James Wilder absorbed 3 separate fragment impacts during the advance across the beach, each one hitting the vest and falling harmlessly away. A rifleman named Thomas Kovacs was hit in the back by a fragment that would have severed his spine, but the overlapping steel plates caught it before it could penetrate. By mid-morning, Haas's company had suffered 32 casualties, but only 6 of them were among the 37 men wearing vests. The other 26 casualties were soldiers without armour, cut down by the same fragment storm that the vested men were surviving. The difference was statistically impossible to ignore and tactically decisive for the unit's effectiveness. Men wearing vests could continue fighting after taking hits that would have incapacitated unprotected soldiers, giving the company sustained combat power that other units lacked. Captain Frank Morrison, the company commander, noticed the disparity by noon when his unit finally established a foothold on the bluffs overlooking the beach. He'd watched vested soldiers take hits and keep fighting while unprotected men went down from wounds that appeared superficial by comparison. During a brief lull in the fighting, he found Haas and asked for an explanation. Haas showed him the vest, explained the Fort Benning program, and described the casualty data that had motivated his decision to acquire them. Morrison's response was immediate. He requisitioned a jeep, drove back to the beach where division headquarters was establishing itself, and found the assistant division commander. Within 30 minutes, officers were examining one of the vests and listening to preliminary casualty reports that suggested men wearing them were surviving at dramatically higher rates than unprotected soldiers. By late afternoon, messages were being transmitted back to England requesting information about armour vest availability and production capability. The story might have ended there. Another piece of equipment that proved valuable in combat but arrived too late to affect the invasion. But what happened next demonstrated how institutional resistance to change can persist even in the face of overwhelming evidence. The War Department's initial response to queries about vest production was to reaffirm the January 1943 decision that had cancelled the program. The vests were too heavy, too expensive, and would require diverting resources from higher priority equipment. Field commanders' requests for immediate production were noted but not acted upon. This bureaucratic inertia lasted approximately 3 weeks, until casualty reports from Normandy began arriving in Washington with sufficient detail to show exactly what was happening to soldiers without fragment protection. Medical officers analyzing data from the first month of the campaign documented that 73% of wounds treated in field hospitals were caused by artillery or mortar fragments. The casualty rate among infantry soldiers was running approximately 30% higher than pre-invasion projections, primarily due to the effectiveness of German indirect fire. Simultaneously, after-action reports from units that had participated in the Omaha beach landing began noting the performance of soldiers wearing unofficial armor vests. The 16th Infantry Regiment's report specifically mentioned that soldiers with vests had sustained significantly fewer casualties than unprotected soldiers in the same engagements. Other units that had somehow acquired vests through informal channels reported similar results. The evidence was becoming impossible to dismiss. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The turning point came when General Omar Bradley, commanding the First Army in France, sent a direct communication to the War Department in early July 1944. Bradley had visited field hospitals and spoken with medical officers about the fragment casualty problem. He'd seen the vests that some soldiers had acquired through unofficial channels and had received briefings on their effectiveness. His message was blunt. Fragment casualties were decimating infantry units, and equipment existed to prevent 70% of those casualties. Production needed to begin immediately, regardless of the resource allocation challenges involved. When a theatre commander with Bradley's credibility makes a direct request, bureaucratic resistance tends to evaporate rapidly. The War Department reversed its position within days, authorizing immediate production of armor vests for all infantry and combat engineer units in Europe. Contracts were issued to multiple manufacturers, and production began in August 1944. The first mass-produced vests reached combat units in France by October, 5 months after Huss's 37 soldiers had demonstrated their effectiveness on Omaha Beach. The redesigned production model incorporated improvements based on combat feedback from the soldiers who'd worn the prototypes. The vest was slightly lighter, weighing 8 pounds instead of 9, achieved through more efficient plate arrangement. The canvas carrier was reinforced at stress points where the original design had shown tendency to tear. Adjustable straps allowed better fit across different body types. Most significantly, the plates were arranged to provide maximum protection for vital organs while minimizing restriction of arm movement, addressing one of the primary complaints from soldiers who'd worn the prototypes. Production ramped up rapidly through the fall and winter of 1944. By December, when the Battle of the Bulge erupted in the Ardennes, over 200,000 vests had been distributed to units in Europe. Casualty reports from that battle provided additional confirmation of the vest's effectiveness. Infantry units with full vest distribution sustained fragment casualty rates 42% lower than units still awaiting equipment. Soldiers wearing vests were surviving wounds that would have killed unprotected men, returning to action after brief treatment, instead of being evacuated to rear area hospitals. Medical officers began compiling systematic data on vest performance in combat conditions. Captain Raymond Pruitt, a surgeon with the 4th Infantry Division, conducted a detailed analysis of casualties treated by his unit between November 1944 and January 1945. Of 637 soldiers treated for combat wounds, 409 wore armor vests at the time of injury. Among vested soldiers, only 32 sustained wounds that penetrated the vest, a failure rate of approximately 7%. The other 93% of vested casualties had been wounded in areas the vest didn't protect, primarily the head, arms, and legs. More striking was the comparison between vested and non-vested casualties. Among soldiers without vests, 68% sustained torso wounds that would have been preventable had they worn armor. The data suggested that full vest distribution across all infantry units could reduce overall casualty rates by approximately 30 to 35%, translating to thousands of soldiers who would survive battles that would otherwise have killed or incapacitated them. Staff Sergeant Victor Haas continued serving with the 16th Infantry Regiment through the campaign in northwestern Europe, participating in the advance across France, the fighting in the Hürtgen Forest, and the final push into Germany in 1945. He wore his original prototype vest throughout, and it absorbed 11 separate fragment impacts over the course of the war. Each time, the steel plates stopped fragments that medical officers later confirmed would have caused serious wounds. By war's end, the vest was battered and worn, the canvas torn and repaired multiple times, but still functional. He never received official recognition for his initiative in acquiring the vests that protected his company on Omaha Beach. The Army doesn't award medals for circumventing procurement regulations, regardless of how many lives are saved in the process. His service record contains no mention of the armor vest program or his role in demonstrating their combat effectiveness. He was discharged in November 1945 with the rank of Master Sergeant, returned to Pennsylvania, and resumed his civilian career in industrial safety. He spoke rarely about the war, and when he did, he focused on the men he'd served with rather than the equipment that had helped keep them alive. The armor vest program continued to evolve after the war ended. The design that had proven effective in Europe was refined further, based on lessons from the Pacific Theater, where different combat conditions created different requirements. The Korean War saw continued use and improvement of the concept, with vests incorporating new materials and design principles. By Vietnam, body armor had become standard issue for American combat troops, with designs descended directly from the prototypes that Haas had worn on Omaha Beach. Modern body armor worn by soldiers today represents the culmination of decades of development that began with those experimental vests at Fort Benning in 1942. Advanced materials like Kevlar and ceramic plates offer far superior protection at lower weight than the manganese steel used in World War II, but the fundamental principle remains unchanged. Fragments from explosions cause the majority of casualties in modern combat, and personal armor can prevent most of those casualties if properly designed and consistently worn. The institutional lessons from the armor vest story proved harder to preserve than the technical knowledge. The pattern repeated in subsequent conflicts where life-saving equipment existed but wasn't fielded because of procurement delays, resource allocation disputes, or skepticism from decision-makers far from combat zones. In Iraq and Afghanistan, soldiers and their families purchased commercial body armor to supplement inadequate issue equipment, echoing Haas's initiative in acquiring rejected vests for his company. The Defense Department eventually responded by improving armor standards, just as the War Department had in 1944, but the delay cost lives that better equipment could have saved. The story illustrates a fundamental tension that exists in every military organization between innovation and institutional inertia. Large organizations develop procedures and regulations designed to ensure consistency, control costs, and prevent catastrophic errors. Those same procedures can prevent rapid adaptation to changing conditions, particularly when adaptation requires admitting that previous decisions were flawed. The armor vest program was cancelled in 1943 based on reasonable analysis of competing priorities. Reversing that decision required overcoming institutional momentum, bureaucratic face-saving, and legitimate concerns about resource allocation. What made the difference was evidence from the battlefield that couldn't be dismissed or explained away. When commanders could demonstrate that soldiers wearing vests were surviving at dramatically higher rates than unprotected soldiers, when medical officers could show that fragment casualties were the primary cause of losses, when the arithmetic became so clear that arguing against vest production meant accepting preventable deaths, then the institution adapted. But the adaptation took months, and during those months, soldiers died from wounds that armor could have stopped. The most sobering aspect of the story is how close it came to never happening at all. If Staff Sergeant Haas hadn't heard about the cancelled program, if he hadn't taken the initiative to acquire prototypes through unofficial channels, if his 37 soldiers hadn't worn those vests on Omaha Beach, then the dramatic demonstration of their effectiveness might never have occurred. The War Department might have maintained its position that vests were impractical, and tens of thousands of soldiers might have died from preventable fragment wounds throughout the remainder of the war. Individual initiative by someone close enough to the problem to recognize its importance, determined enough to circumvent obstacles, and positioned to demonstrate the solution's effectiveness under actual combat conditions, made the difference between a rejected prototype gathering dust in a warehouse and life-saving equipment that transformed infantry combat. This pattern appears throughout military history, wherever technological or tactical innovations emerged from the bottom up rather than top down. Junior officers and NCOs who recognized problems that senior leadership hadn't seen, who improvised solutions using available resources, who proved concepts under fire before formal approval could be obtained. The veterans of that first wave on Omaha Beach carried memories of the fragment storm that swept the beach, the distinctive sound of steel hitting steel as plates stopped shrapnel, the surreal experience of taking hits that should have been fatal and continuing to fight. For the soldiers wearing those rejected vests, the difference between survival and death came down to 9 pounds of manganese steel plates that the Army had decided they didn't need. They knew with absolute certainty that institutional wisdom had been wrong and that one sergeant's refusal to accept that wisdom had saved their lives. Captain Frank Morrison, who commanded the company that included Haas's platoon, returned to the United States after the war and eventually retired as a colonel. In a letter written in 1963 to a military historian researching the Normandy invasion, he reflected on the armor vest controversy. Morrison wrote that the vests represented everything right and wrong about how large military organizations function under stress. Wrong in that obvious solutions to known problems can be rejected for reasons that make sense on paper but collapse under combat conditions. Right in that when evidence becomes overwhelming, the institution eventually adapts regardless of how much momentum has to be overcome. He specifically credited Haas with saving lives through initiative that violated regulations but served the mission. Military organizations function through discipline and adherence to orders, Morrison wrote, but sometimes they also require individuals willing to exercise judgment contrary to official policy when lives hang in the balance. Haas was that kind of soldier, and the men who survived because of the armor he provided understood that they owed their lives to someone who knew when to ignore the manual. The fragment casualty statistics from World War II changed how military planners thought about infantry protection for every conflict that followed. The knowledge that fragments caused 70 to 80% of combat casualties meant that any equipment protecting soldiers from fragments would have disproportionate impact on survival rates. This understanding drove development of not just improved body armor, but also armored vehicles, protective positions, and tactical doctrines designed to minimize exposure to indirect fire. The steel plates in those World War II vests evolved into the sophisticated protection systems that soldiers wear today, systems that have saved thousands of lives in Iraq and Afghanistan and will continue saving lives in future conflicts. But the technical legacy is less important than the human story at the program's core. 37 soldiers walking up Omaha Beach wearing armor that shouldn't have existed, protection that had been officially rejected, equipment that they'd acquired through back-channel arrangements because someone believed that statistics about fragment casualties mattered more than procurement regulations. Those soldiers survived wounds that killed men to their left and right, not through luck or divine intervention, but because one staff sergeant had done the arithmetic and decided that 10 pounds of steel was a reasonable trade for 70% reduction in casualty risk. The implementation of widespread vest distribution through late 1944 and into 1945 revealed complexities that the initial combat trials on Omaha Beach hadn't exposed. While the effectiveness of the armor remained undeniable, integrating it into doctrine and training proved challenging in ways that highlighted the difference between proving a concept works and making it work at scale across an entire theater of operations. The first challenge was logistical. Manufacturing 200,000 vests required coordination among multiple contractors, each producing components that needed to meet exacting specifications. The manganese steel plates had to be heat-treated to specific hardness levels. Too soft, and they wouldn't stop fragments effectively. Too hard, and they became brittle and prone to shattering on impact. Quality control inspectors at manufacturing facilities rejected entire production runs when hardness testing revealed plates outside acceptable tolerances. The canvas carriers presented their own complications. Military specifications called for double-stitched seams using heavy-duty thread, with reinforcement at all stress points. Contractors accustomed to producing standard uniforms had to retool their facilities and retrain workers for the heavier construction required. Early production runs showed unacceptable failure rates where stitching separated under the stress of combat use. Engineers redesigned the carrier pattern 3 times, before achieving a configuration that consistently survived field conditions. Distribution through the supply chain created bottlenecks that frustrated commanders, whose units remained unequipped, while vests accumulated at rear area depots. The Army's supply system prioritized ammunition, fuel, and food, items that units consumed continuously and required constant replenishment. Body armor was classified as organizational equipment, issued once and expected to last indefinitely. This classification meant vests moved through different supply channels than consumable items, and those channels operated more slowly. Units that had participated in the Normandy invasion received priority for vest distribution, which made tactical sense but created resentment among divisions arriving in France during summer and fall of 1944. Soldiers in newly arrived units understood they were facing the same fragment threat that had devastated earlier waves on Omaha Beach, yet they went into combat without protection that they knew existed. Company commanders pleaded with supply officers, who could only explain that vests would arrive according to priority allocations, determined at levels far above battalion or even division headquarters. Training presented another layer of complexity. Soldiers needed time to adapt to fighting while wearing the additional weight. The 9-pound vest became oppressive during sustained operations, particularly when combined with other equipment loads. Infantry soldiers in Europe typically carried rifles weighing 8 to 9 pounds, ammunition loads of approximately 15 pounds, grenades, entrenching tools, gas masks, water, rations, and personal items. Total combat loads frequently exceeded 90 pounds before adding the vest. Physical conditioning programs at replacement training centers were modified to prepare soldiers for the vest's weight. New arrivals spent weeks conducting march training, obstacle courses, and combat drills while wearing full equipment, including armor. The adaptation period proved essential. Soldiers who received vests immediately before entering combat struggled with the weight and sometimes discarded them during extended operations. Those who'd trained with vests for weeks developed techniques for moving efficiently and accepted the weight as normal. Tactical doctrine evolved as commanders gained experience employing armored infantry. The vest's protection against fragments made certain tactical approaches more viable than they'd been with unprotected soldiers. Aggressive patrolling through areas under intermittent artillery fire became less costly when soldiers could survive fragment hits that would previously have caused casualties. Attacks across open ground under mortar fire, previously avoided whenever possible, became acceptable risks when fragment protection reduced casualty rates. But the vests created new vulnerabilities that experienced soldiers learned to recognize and exploit. German snipers and machine gunners observed that American infantry wearing vests moved differently, with slightly restricted upper body mobility that created recognizable patterns. They adjusted their tactics accordingly, targeting heads and legs rather than torsos. Casualty reports from late 1944 showed an increase in leg wounds and head wounds as German soldiers adapted to fighting armored American infantry. The psychological impact of wearing armor proved more complex than planners had anticipated. Some soldiers developed overconfidence, taking unnecessary risks because they felt protected. Company commanders had to emphasize repeatedly that vests stopped fragments but not bullets at close range, and that protected soldiers could still be killed by head wounds, leg wounds, or hits to unarmored areas. The vest provided an edge, not invulnerability, but some soldiers needed to learn that lesson through near misses before the message truly registered. Other soldiers experienced the opposite reaction. Men who'd taken fragment hits that their vests stopped became acutely aware of how close they'd come to serious wounds or death. Some developed heightened anxiety about combat, constantly conscious of the impacts they'd absorbed and wondering when a fragment might hit an unprotected area. Medical officers treating combat exhaustion cases noted that soldiers who'd survived multiple vest impacts sometimes showed symptoms similar to men who'd been wounded, even though they'd suffered no physical injury. The vests required maintenance that added to soldiers' daily burdens in the field. Canvas carriers became filthy during normal operations, caked with mud, soaked with rain, and worn at stress points. Soldiers were supposed to clean and inspect their vests regularly, checking for torn stitching or damaged plates. In practice, during sustained combat operations, Maintenance often got deferred until vests began showing obvious signs of failure. Units rotating out of the line for rest and refit received directives to conduct comprehensive equipment maintenance, including armor inspection, but the time available never seemed adequate for everything that needed attention. Damaged vests presented disposal and replacement challenges. The Army's property accountability system required documentation when equipment was lost or destroyed in combat. Soldiers whose vests were damaged beyond repair through fragment impacts or general wear needed to turn in the damaged equipment and receive replacement authorization before being issued new vests. This process worked adequately in rear areas but broke down during active operations. Many soldiers simply retained damaged vests rather than navigating the paperwork required for replacement, continuing to wear armor with compromised protection because inadequate armor seemed preferable to none at all. The winter campaign of 1944 through 45 imposed additional stresses on both equipment and soldiers. The vest's canvas carriers absorbed water during rain and snow, adding several pounds to their weight. Wet canvas froze in sub-zero temperatures, creating rigid shells that restricted movement and made the vests uncomfortable to wear for extended periods. Soldiers learned to waterproof their vests using wax or petroleum-based compounds, techniques passed informally through units based on trial and error rather than any official guidance. Replacement soldiers arriving in Europe during winter often received vests that had already seen months of hard use, turned in by casualties or soldiers rotating home. These hand-me-down vests frequently showed wear that reduced their effectiveness. Plates were bent from impacts, stitching was frayed, and carriers were stained with the previous wearer's blood. Receiving such equipment proved psychologically difficult for young soldiers preparing for their first combat, a tangible reminder that they were replacing men who'd been killed or wounded while wearing the same protection they were now expected to trust with their lives. Medical officers continued collecting data on vest performance throughout the winter campaign, and their findings refined understanding of both the armor's capabilities and limitations. Analysis of several thousand casualties treated between November 1944 and February 1945 revealed patterns that informed both tactical employment and equipment development. Fragment wounds to the torso decreased significantly among vested soldiers, validating the design's effectiveness. However, the percentage of head and extremity wounds increased proportionally, suggesting that German forces were adapting their tactics to target unprotected areas. The data also revealed that vest effectiveness varied based on the type of munitions producing fragments. Fragments from German 88mm shells, which constituted the majority of artillery threats, were stopped reliably by the vest's steel plates. Mortar fragments, typically smaller and traveling at lower velocities, were stopped even more consistently. But fragments from certain types of aerial bombs, particularly large-caliber weapons that produced exceptionally high-velocity fragments, sometimes penetrated the vests. These penetrations remained relatively rare, accounting for less than 5% of torso wounds among vested casualties, but they demonstrated that the armor had limits. The Battle of the Bulge in December 1944 provided the most comprehensive test of armored infantry doctrine under extreme conditions. German forces attacking through the Ardennes achieved tactical surprise and drove deep salients into American lines. Infantry units found themselves engaged in defensive fighting under conditions where German artillery and mortar fire dominated the battlefield. Casualty rates during the first week of the offensive were catastrophic in units without full vest distribution, while units that had received complete armor allocation sustained significantly lower losses. First Lieutenant Robert Marsh commanded an infantry company in the 2nd Infantry Division that absorbed the initial German assault near Elsenborn Ridge. His company had received vests in October and had trained extensively with them during the relatively quiet period before the German offensive. When the attack came on December 16th, his men were dug into defensive positions that came under intensive German artillery preparation. The barrage lasted 90 minutes, dropping approximately 500 shells on positions occupied by fewer than 150 American soldiers. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.